All right, today we are going to talk about Europe again, but today we're going to talk about medieval society, kind of the characteristics that both Western and Eastern Europe shares. Now, in both Western and Eastern Europe, but especially in Western Europe, most people were poor, unsophisticated farmers. There were artisans and educated people, but there were only few of them that lived in cities. Most people lived on farms, were not very advanced. Now, these farmers used something called the three-field system, which is a good advanced farming technique. And basically, they had three fields. And every year they would leave one of them fallow, which means they would not grow crops on them. And that lets the nutrients in the soil replenish themselves so that these pieces of land are going to continue to produce a large amount of crops for them. And this helps their population grow. Now, where they farmed was actually called a manor. Here you can kind of see a picture of a manor. They had the manor house up top, which is where the noble lived, the person who owned all the land. And then surrounding that would be a village of peasants, basically. You'd have a church, the village, they'd have a pasture for their animals, and they'd have their three fields that they planted on. And they'd also have, people who could make tools and things like that. But it was a self-sufficient village. And these nobles would let the peasants live on their land for a portion of their goods. Now, this manorial system is going to develop into the dominant political and economic system in Europe, which is called feudalism. Feudalism is a hierarchical political and economic system. And there are basically five classes. Okay? The king is at the top. And he offers protection to everybody below him and land to everybody below him. And in return, they give him loyalty and taxes. Okay? Below him is lords or barons. These are basically names for nobles. They're given land by the king, but they must pay the taxes and be loyal. And being loyal includes serving in the military, going and fighting if the king needs it. Okay? Below the lords, barons, and nobles are the vassals. These are basically smaller nobles. They have smaller pieces of land, and they basically have the same criteria as the nobles themselves. Okay? Below them is the knights. This is a warrior class of people that live by a code of honor called chivalry. And chivalry basically determined their everyday actions, but mostly it stressed loyalty to the lords, the kings, and to God. Now, the final thing is the serfs. These are peasants. These are the laborers that basically create goods or grow food for all of the classes above it. Okay, so the peasants would have to give a portion of their goods to the vassal, which would give a portion of that to the lord, which would give a portion of that to the king. Okay? And in return, they're allowed to live on the land and farm because they don't own the land. And so the lords let them live there to grow crops. They have land that they can actually farm on, but they have to give a large portion of that to the higher classes. And this oftentimes left the peasants with very little. In Europe, they also developed something called the Hanseatic League. The people that were artisans and educated people, these merchants that were producing fine goods, created an organization to increase trade in Europe. Feudalism was very much based on self-sufficiency. You had what you needed, but they wanted to increase trade. So they started all these trade routes, started this organization. But this organization often had laws of its own that superseded the kingdom's laws. So oftentimes this had a lot of power. Also, there were many Jews that became involved in banking because it was not a sin for Jews to loan money with interest. For Christians at that time, it was a sin. So Christians couldn't really be involved in banking. And Jews became very wealthy because of this. Urban areas became very much more sophisticated. They started developing urban centers. The cities such as Venice and Genoa and Constantinople, where trade took place. They often had schools with education, guilds where people could go and learn a trade or a craft so they could become an artisan. Literacy also increased. There were a lot of books like Song of Roland, the Canterbury Tales, Beowulf, things like that, where people were reading and becoming more educated. Then they also had a new form of architecture called Gothic architecture. You can kind of see this church down here, this different style of architecture, which was pretty advanced. Women in medieval society, generally speaking, did not have very much power. Mostly they didn't have power because they were not able to own land. And so in medieval society, land is power. The king gives power, gives land to the nobles, which gives them power, control of land. Women, they can't own land, they can't have power. But also the idea of chivalry, that code of honor that knights had, made women inferior too, because they are basically valued only for their beauty and not for other feminine qualities that they might possess. In Europe, too, they also experienced a devastating disease called the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. Now, this disease spread from Central Asia, especially from the Mongols, which we'll get to a little bit later. But it spread so much in Europe, even more than other places around the world, because their lack of medical knowledge. Remember, the Europeans were not very sophisticated, especially in Western Europe. And so this made it spread even quickly. It's an estimated over 25 million people died, which is a lot of people for that time period. And because so many people were dying, and the church really couldn't do anything, the Roman Catholic Church couldn't do anything about this, this really hurt the church's influence over Europe. So people started to lose their faith in the church's ability to basically save them. But basically, if you look at these pictures down the bottom, the disease started the bacteria that was carried on fleas that were on rats, and then it would give people these nasty boils that they would die from very shortly. Another thing that Europeans were involved in were the Crusades. This is where Christians from Eastern and Western Europe gathered together, and they went out to fight the Muslims. They wanted to win back their Holy Land, the Jerusalem, which is where Jesus was walking, okay, where he lived, where all these biblical stories occurred. They wanted to have that land. They also wanted to capture some holy relics like the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, things like that. And they actually went on 8 crusades in all. Now, the Christians mostly lost. Sometimes they would gain some territory, but then the Muslims would take it right back. Because the Muslims had a superior empire at that time. They were much more advanced, much stronger empire. But one thing that benefited the Europeans, even though they lost a lot of people, wasted a lot of time or money, they did learn about Greek reason, ancient literature, and a lot of advancements from the Muslims. Things like gunpowder, so they're going to later on develop guns, things like that, which is really going to help them advance. And if it weren't for this, then Europeans wouldn't become, in the next year, they'll become the most advanced civilization. And if it weren't for this cultural diffusion, that would never have happened. So that is medieval society.